Doctors gave up on dying SEAL sniper. The moment the nurse spoke call sign, he reacted immediately. The ventilator breathed for him because he had forgotten how. That was the first thing Dr. Alan Greer noticed when he walked into Bay 4 of the intensive care unit at Balboa Naval Medical Center on a Tuesday morning that smelled like recycled air and floor cleaner. Not the chart, not the monitors screaming numbers in green and orange. The ventilator, doing the one job a human body is supposed to do without being asked. He had been a physician for 19 years. He had stood in rooms like this more times than he could count on both hands. He had learned, somewhere around year 6 or 7, not to let the machines rattle him. They were tools, they were not verdicts. But sometimes they were. The man in the bed was 34 years old. His name, according to the chart clipped to the footboard, was Nathan Cole. That was all Alan knew about him when he first walked in. A name, an age, a series of numbers on monitors that told a story nobody in the room wanted to read out loud. Nathan had been brought in 41 hours earlier. The details were classified in ways that Alan had learned not to push against. What he knew was this. Nathan had been injured during an overseas operation. He had been stabilized enough to be transported. He had arrived at Balboa barely holding on, and in the hours since his arrival, barely holding on had become something even more fragile than that. There were 4 men standing along the far wall. They were not family. Alan could tell that much without asking. Family members held things. Phones, tissues, coffee cups, each other. These men held nothing. They stood with their arms at their sides or loosely crossed, and they watched the room the way people watch a road they have driven 100 times. Not with fear, with attention. Nobody had asked them to leave. One of the nurses on the previous shift had tried, gently, explaining that the unit had a visitor policy. The man nearest the door had looked at her. Just looked. She had not asked again. Alan reviewed the chart at the bedside. He read every number twice. He read the overnight notes from the resident who had been managing Nathan's case through the night. He put the chart down and looked at the man in the bed for a long moment. Nathan Cole did not look like a man who was going to get better. His skin had the color and texture that Alan associated with a body that was working too hard at too many things at once. His blood pressure had been unstable through the night, drifting low and then correcting, and then drifting low again. His brain activity was present but minimal in ways that the neurologist on call had described in careful, hedged language that meant, translated into plain words, that something was wrong in there, and nobody was sure how wrong. He had not responded to his name. That had been noted 3 times in the overnight chart. The resident had called his name clearly, at intervals, as part of the standard assessment. Nathan Cole. Nathan, Mr. Cole. Nothing. No eye movement. No change in the numbers. No pressure around a testing finger. Alan stood at the bedside for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He was not a man given to sentiment on the floor. He had built a career on being useful and clear-headed in rooms where other people were falling apart. But there was something about the 4 men along the wall that caught in him like a splinter. The way they stood, the way none of them looked at each other, the way they had, apparently, been there through the night without sleeping, without eating anything that the nurses had seen, without being asked to stay by anyone with the authority to make them. He had seen families keep vigil. He had seen friends do it. He had seen chaplains and colleagues and commanding officers in this hospital more times than he liked. He had never quite seen anything like 4 men standing along a wall like load-bearing columns in a building that was still deciding whether to fall. He asked the charge nurse, a woman named Paula Greer who was no relation and had been working the unit for 11 years, whether Nathan had shown any response to anything in the night. Paula shook her head. She said it without looking up from the workstation. She had the practiced economy of someone who had delivered this particular kind of answer many times. Alan nodded. He picked up the chart again and made his notes. He ordered adjustments to 2 of Nathan's medications. He considered the neurologist's recommendation for additional imaging and agreed with it. He did everything that the situation required him to do. Then he walked to the door of Bay 4 and stopped. He turned back to the room, to the monitors, to the ventilator doing its patient, mechanical work, to the 4 men on the wall who had not moved. He said, to no one in particular, that they had done everything available to them, that Nathan's condition was serious in ways that went beyond what they could treat directly, that the body was doing what the body was doing, and medicine had limits, and those limits had been reached. It was not a speech. It was a statement. He had learned the difference over 19 years. One of the men on the wall, tall, with a jaw that looked like it had been shaped by something industrial, dark circles under eyes that had clearly not closed in 30 hours or more, turned his head and looked at Alan. Not with anger, not with grief exactly, with something that had no clean medical name. Alan held the look for a moment. Then he said he was sorry. He meant it. He walked out. The ventilator kept breathing. Paula stood at her workstation and did not write anything for a moment after the doctor left. She had heard what he said. She had heard versions of it before, in different words, with different patients. She had learned to process it and keep moving because the unit did not stop when a doctor said the hard thing out loud. But she stood there for a moment longer than her usual. The door to Bay 4 was still open. She could see the edge of the bed. She could see the foot of Nathan Cole resting under the sheet, motionless, in the specific way of a person who was not sleeping. She picked up her clipboard. She walked to the next bay. She did her checks. She updated her notes. She did it all correctly and on time. But something sat in the back of her mind like a stone at the bottom of a clear pool, small, still, not going anywhere. It was the men on the wall. In 11 years, she had seen a lot of people keep vigil at bedsides in this unit. She had seen grief move through people in all kinds of ways. She had seen anger and denial and bargaining, and the particular exhausted quiet of a person who had run out of prayers but could not make themselves leave. She had never seen 4 men stand that still for that long. Not out of shock, not out of helplessness. They stood the way you stand when you are covering a position, when walking away is simply not an option you are entertaining, when the mission is not over because you have not said it is over. She went back to her workstation. She pulled Nathan's chart and read it from the beginning. Every note, every number, every attempted assessment. Nathan Cole, Nathan, Mr. Cole. No response. She set the chart down and looked at the monitor at her station that showed the readouts from Bay 4. The numbers flickered. The ventilator cycled. The body did what the body was doing. She looked at the door to Bay 4. Paula Greer had worked this unit for 11 years, and she had developed, in that time, a habit that her colleagues sometimes called superstition. She did not call it anything. She just did it. She talked to her patients, not in the performing, cheerful way that some nurses did, explaining every procedure in bright tones designed to comfort an alert person. She talked to the ones who could not answer. She talked to them the way you talk to someone in the next room, like the wall between you is thin, like they can hear you through it if they want to. She had never been able to explain what made her start doing it. She had never been able to point to a specific moment where it had made a measurable difference. She thought about the men on the wall. She thought about the way the one with the dark circles had looked at Dr. Greer when the doctor said they had done everything available. Not grief, not anger. Something that was made of neither of those things, and was somehow more serious than both. She picked up her clipboard and walked toward Bay 4. The ventilator breathed. The monitors kept their numbers. The 4 men stood along the wall, and one of them, the tall one with the dark circles, turned his head slightly when she walked in, tracking her the way you track movement in a space you are responsible for. She did not look at them directly. She went to the bedside. She checked the lines, the monitor leads, the position of the pillow under Nathan's head. She did everything that the situation required her to do. Then she stayed. She stood at the bedside for a moment, looking at Nathan Cole's face, the face of a man who had been 34 years old when he arrived at this hospital, which meant he had survived 34 years of something that had eventually brought him here, to this bed, with 4 men standing against the wall behind her. She had a question. She was not sure, entirely, why she had it. It had something to do with the chart, and the name on the chart, and the fact that the name on the chart had been called into this room 3 times the night before and had not received an answer. She turned slightly toward the 4 men. She spoke quietly, because the unit was quiet and because what she was about to ask was not something that needed to fill a room. She asked them what they called him. The tall one with the dark circles looked at her for a long moment. The other 3 did not move. He told her. 2 words, she repeated them to herself, silently. She turned back to the bed. She leaned slightly closer to Nathan Cole, and she spoke the call sign into the room. Outside, in the hallway, Dr. Alan Greer was writing his notes at the rolling workstation near the nursing station. He was recording his assessment and his orders in the careful, specific language of a man who had been doing this for 19 years. He was not thinking about Bay 4 anymore. He was doing what the situation required. The unit was quiet. Then Paula appeared in the doorway of Bay 4. She was not running. She was not calling out. She simply stood in the doorway and looked at Alan with an expression that he would think about later, when he was trying to describe this day to himself. It was not an expression he had a word for. It was the expression of someone who had just seen something that the chart did not have a category for. She said, calmly, that he needed to come back to Bay 4. He came. The ventilator was still breathing. The monitors still showed their numbers. Nathan Cole still lay in the bed with the stillness of a man who had not moved in 41 hours. But the tall man with the dark circles was no longer standing against the wall. He was at the bedside, because Nathan Cole's hand had moved. It started before Nathan's family knew his middle name, before his record was pulled from whatever vault it sat in, before anyone in that unit had a full picture of who the man in Bay 4 actually was. What they had was a name on a chart, a set of numbers on monitors, and the knowledge that somewhere before Balboa, before the transport, before the 41 hours of machines breathing for him, there had been a life that had made him worth flying home. Nathan Cole had grown up in a place that shaped people the way rivers shape stone. Slow, constant, leaving marks that you don't fully understand until you are far enough away to look back at them. He was from a small town in Western Virginia, the kind of place where the roads have names but no signs because everyone already knows what they are called. His father had worked in infrastructure, the kind of work that requires you to be outside in all weather and to not complain about it. His mother had taught elementary school for 26 years. He had not been an obvious candidate for anything exceptional. That was what people said later, in the way that people always construct a narrative after the fact. He had been quiet in school, not in a troubled way, in a listening way. His teachers noted it. He had the particular quality of someone who was always paying attention to something slightly further away than what was directly in front of him. He played 2 sports in high school, competently but not brilliantly. He got decent grades. He had friends, but not the kind of friends who were also the center of any particular story. He was, by most external measures, unremarkable. But he had a thing with distances. Not in any mystical sense. Literally. He could see far. He had always been able to. His father had noticed it when Nathan was about 7 years old, pointing at something on a hillside that his father could not see at all, describing it precisely. A bird. The specific kind of bird, the color of its head. His father had pulled out old binoculars from the glove box of the truck and looked. Nathan had been right. His father did not make a big thing of it. He just bought Nathan a pair of binoculars for Christmas that year, and, 2 years later, when Nathan had outgrown those, a better pair. By the time Nathan was in high school, this had evolved into a quiet interest in long-range target shooting at the range outside of town, which had evolved, with the same quiet inevitability that seemed to govern most things in Nathan's life, into a level of accuracy that the range owner eventually stopped knowing how to accommodate. He enlisted at 18. It was not a dramatic decision. He did not announce it. He told his parents at dinner one evening, and his father nodded, and his mother said she had been expecting it, which surprised Nathan, and probably should not have. Basic training revealed things. It always does. It revealed that Nathan could run further and longer than most people his age, without his expression changing. It revealed that he did not require much sleep to function at full capacity, which was a trait that would prove useful in ways he could not have predicted at 18. It revealed that he had a temperament under pressure that some of his instructors described, when they were being professional, as steady, and when they were being honest, as something closer to unsettling. He did not rattle. That was the simplest way to put it. The kind of situations that rattled people did not rattle Nathan Cole. He would look at a difficult thing with the same expression he used for everything else, which was to say, a kind of quiet, focused calm that did not change with the temperature of the room. He was noticed. The notice came in the form of a conversation, about a year into his service, with a man he would later know as Chief Petty Officer Dennis Holt, which was the kind of name that belongs on a mailbox in a suburb, but belonged, in this case, to a man built like the letter L and twice as direct. Dennis Holt asked Nathan one question. He asked him if he wanted to do something harder. Nathan said yes. He did not ask what. He just said yes. That was, Dennis would recall later, the correct answer. What followed was the kind of training that does not get described in polite company. Not because of any formal restriction, but because the vocabulary for it does not translate well to people who have not been through it. It was water and cold and sand, and the specific kind of exhaustion that stops being physical somewhere around hour 30 and becomes something more fundamental, something that reaches down past the muscles and the lungs and starts asking questions of whatever it is that actually keeps a person going when the body has already sent in its resignation. Some people answered those questions correctly. Some did not. Nathan answered them correctly. He answered them with the same quiet steadiness that had made Dennis Holt notice him in the first place. He did not quit. He did not produce drama about not quitting. He simply continued. When other men rang the bell and stepped away, Nathan looked at the bell the way he looked at everything slightly too far away to touch, and then looked back at what was in front of him and kept going. He earned his place. The trident that went with it was not a symbol to him in any way he would have bothered to articulate. It was a result. He had done a thing, and this was what the thing looked like when it was done. He went to work. Over the following years, Nathan Cole became, in the specific and unglamorous way of men who are very good at a very particular thing, exceptional at his job. The job involved distances. It involved patience measured in hours, sometimes in days. It involved lying in positions that made ordinary discomfort feel like a memory, waiting for a moment that might or might not arrive, and being precisely ready for it either way. He was good at the waiting. He was better at the moment. There were missions that he could not discuss and would not, even years later, with people who had clearance to hear them. Not out of secrecy exactly, but out of the same economy of words that governed everything else about him. The things that had happened had happened. They were filed away in the same internal system that kept him functioning and did not require regular review. What he carried more visibly was his team. The men he worked with closest were not his friends in the ordinary sense. They were something that the English language does not have a clean word for. They were the people whose lives had been, at various specific moments, mathematically dependent on what Nathan did or did not do in the next 2 seconds, and he had been that for them as well. When you have lived inside that kind of interdependence for long enough, the word friend starts to feel like it was built for a smaller thing. One of those men was a guy named Craig Barton, who was from Texas and talked like it, and who had once spent 4 hours lying completely still in a drainage ditch next to Nathan, without either of them saying a single word, and then stood up when it was over and said, clear-eyed and calm, that he could eat. Nathan had laughed at that. Actually laughed. It was one of the things Craig kept in a private mental file of things he was proud of, making Nathan Cole actually laugh, because it did not happen often, and when it did, it was the real version. Craig was one of the 4 men on the wall. He was the tall one with the dark circles. He had not slept since he got the call. He had not eaten more than a protein bar out of a cargo pocket somewhere over the Atlantic. He had arrived at Balboa with the other 3, and they had walked into the ICU with the specific authority of men who have decided that something is happening and no policy is going to be the reason it does not. He had stood on that wall and watched the machines breathe for his friend, and had done what he always did when there was nothing actionable to do, which was to stay anyway. Presence was always actionable. He had learned that early and had never stopped believing it. He had watched the doctor come and go. He had heard what the doctor said, every word of it, translated it accurately, and had filed it in the same internal place he filed everything that could not be changed right now. He had watched the nurse come in, the one on the day shift who had not tried to move them, and had instead read the chart from the beginning. He had noticed her the way he noticed anyone who entered a space he was covering, tracked her, assessed her. She moved differently than the others. She moved like someone who was thinking about something. When she turned and asked, quietly, what they called him, Craig had looked at her for a long moment. He measured people in that moment. He always did. Not consciously, anymore. It had become automatic, the way breathing is automatic. He measured her steadiness, her intention, the quality of her attention, the fact that she had asked quietly, the fact that she was not holding a clipboard when she asked it. He told her. He did not explain why she was asking or why he was answering. He just told her. She turned back to the bed, and Craig watched her lean slightly forward, and she said the call sign. The call sign that Nathan had gotten on his 3rd deployment. The call sign that had been given to him by a team sergeant, who was now retired and living in Montana, and who had given it because of a specific incident involving a target at a distance that had made the sergeant stop what he was doing and stand still for a moment with his mouth slightly open before he collected himself and shook his head and said, under his breath, that Nathan Cole could see the back of the future. The call sign that his team used for him in the same way they used their own names, automatically, without wait, because it had become what he was called and that was all. The call sign that had never appeared on a chart. Paula said it clearly, without drama. The way you say a name you are not sure will be heard, but say it anyway, because you are the kind of person who says things anyway. And in the bed, under the sheet, under the lines and the monitor leads and the weight of 41 hours of machines doing the work for him, Nathan Cole's right hand closed. Not a reflex, not a medication-related movement, not the kind of thing that gets written off as involuntary in a chart. His fingers curled, deliberately, slowly, the way a hand moves when someone is trying very hard to do something through a very long distance. Craig was at the bedside before he had decided to move. He put his hand under Nathan's hand, and Nathan's fingers tightened around his. Not much, the grip of a man reaching across an enormous distance using whatever he had left. But it was Nathan's grip. Craig knew it the same way he knew his own hand, the specific way Nathan held. He had felt it before in darkness, in confirmation, in moments that did not have names. He looked at Paula. She was already looking at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Craig said, and his voice had a quality in it that it did not normally have, that she needed to go get the doctor. The doctor came back to a room that had changed. Dr. Alan Greer stood in the doorway of Bay 4 and looked at what was in front of him, and was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man recalibrating. Craig Barton was at the bedside. His hand was under Nathan's hand. The other three men had come off the wall, not dramatically, not in a rush, but forward, closer, drawn by something they could feel in the air of the room the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Paula stood near the monitor, watching the numbers. Alan walked in. He went to the bedside and stood across from Craig and looked at Nathan Cole's face, and then at Nathan's hand, and then at the monitors. He said Nathan's name. Nathan did not respond to his name. The monitors did not change. Nothing on the outside moved. But the hand around Craig's fingers tightened fractionally, and Craig said so, immediately, without raising his voice, the way you report something you are certain of. Alan looked at him. He asked him to confirm what he was saying. Craig confirmed it. His voice was steady. It had the quality of a man who is not in the habit of saying things he is not certain of. Alan reached across and placed 2 fingers against Nathan's wrist, not for the pulse, for pressure response. He pressed gently. He watched the face. He waited. A pause that stretched like the second before something. And then Nathan's face moved. Not a dramatic movement, not a gasp or a flinch or the movie version of a man coming back from somewhere. A shift. The muscles around his eyes tightened slightly. A micro-expression. The face of a man who was somewhere very far away and had heard something he recognized. Alan was still. He had been a physician for 19 years. He had seen things go wrong in rooms like this with a specificity and frequency that had changed the shape of how he experienced hope. He did not trust what he was seeing until he saw it twice. He leaned slightly forward. He spoke, not Nathan's name, but the call sign. Paula had told him in the hallway, 2 words, quiet. He said it now. And Nathan Cole opened his eyes. Not all the way. Not the clear, present eyes of a man who had simply woken up from sleep. The eyes of a man who had traveled an enormous distance in a very short time and had arrived somewhere that still required a great deal of effort to remain in. But open. The left eye more than the right. The pupils uneven, which was something to look at carefully. But the eyes were open, and they moved, slowly, with enormous effort, until they found the thing closest to them, which was Craig's face. Craig's jaw tightened. He said, in a voice that was held together by practice and not much else at that moment, that Nathan was going to need to stop this kind of thing, that they were all getting too old for it, that the next time he wanted attention, he could send an email. Nathan did not laugh. He could not laugh, but something in his face moved in a way that was not pain and was not confusion. Alan was already moving. He was calling out to Paula, listing things he needed, his voice shifting into the gear it used when there was something to be done, when the situation had changed into something that had actions attached to it. He was recalculating every assessment he had made in the previous 41 hours, not discarding the data, but looking at it now through a different understanding. The monitors did not dramatically change. The ventilator kept breathing for Nathan because Nathan still needed it to. The room did not transform. The numbers did not suddenly correct themselves into the picture of a man who was fine. But the eyes were open, and they were tracking. Paula stood near the monitor and watched Nathan's face, and did not write anything for a moment. She had done the things she did. She had talked to a patient who could not answer. She had used the word that the chart did not have. She had not known it would work. She had simply known it was the thing left to try after everything else had been tried, and so she had tried it. She would not call it anything later. When the other nurses on the unit asked her, as they inevitably did, what had happened in Bay 4, she said that she had changed her approach. That was all. Alan Greer ordered updated imaging. He contacted the neurologist. He revised his medication orders. He did everything that the situation now required, which was a different set of things than it had required an hour ago. He did not say that he had been wrong. He had not been wrong, exactly. He had been working with the information he had, and the information he had had pointed where it had pointed. What had changed was not the information. What had changed was the variable that the information did not include. You cannot measure a call sign on a monitor. You cannot chart identity. You cannot put a number next to the thing in a person that decides, in the absence of almost everything else, that it is not done yet. He stood at the foot of Nathan's bed after the initial wave of orders had been made, and he looked at the man in the bed, and he was quiet for a moment. Nathan's eyes had closed again, not the closing of before, not the stillness of a body that had stopped answering, the closing of a man who had made an enormous effort and needed to rest from it. His hand was still around Craig's. Alan looked at Craig. He did not say anything that was an apology, and he did not say anything that was a declaration. He said that they should be prepared for a long road. Craig said they were not going anywhere. Alan believed him. He picked up the chart at the foot of the bed, the chart that said Nathan Cole at the top and had no line for what had just happened, and he began to write the most unusual update note of his 19-year career. The long road was exactly that. It did not resolve quickly. It did not provide the clean, ascending line that stories sometimes give recovery for the sake of neatness. The body that had spent 41 hours being kept alive by machines did not simply thank everyone for their patience and stand up. It worked. Day by day, in small, measurable increments that the medical team recorded and the monitors tracked, Nathan Cole's body began to do more of its own work. The ventilator was reduced. The pressure support came down in stages, each stage a negotiation between what the machines were providing and what Nathan's lungs were willing to take back on their own terms. He was not present in any continuous way during those first days. He surfaced and went under, opened his eyes and closed them, was there and then not there, in ways that the team had expected, but that were still strange to watch. His grip on Craig's hand remained, even when his eyes were closed and he was somewhere else. It was the most reliable thing about him in those early days. Paula managed his care with the same quiet steadiness she brought to all of her patients, and without the self-consciousness of someone who believed she had done something notable. She had done what the situation needed. The situation had moved forward. She had other patients, other rooms, other people who needed the same quality of attention. But she checked on Nathan more than was strictly required by the schedule, not out of any particular attachment. She did not personalize her patients in ways that made the work unsustainable. But she checked on him because she understood something about what had happened in that room, something she did not have precise language for, which was this. The thing that had answered was still fragile. It was present, and it was real, and it had proved itself, but it was still connected to a body that was doing very difficult work, and it needed to be reminded, occasionally, that it was still being heard. She used the call sign, not every time, not in a formal way, just sometimes. When she was doing her checks and the room was quiet, she would say it the way you say something under your breath that you mean seriously. And each time, without fail, Nathan's face would shift slightly, not always an opening of the eyes, sometimes just the tightening of the muscles at the edge of his jaw, sometimes a change in his breathing. The monitors sometimes registered something, and sometimes did not. But the man in the bed always knew he had been called. Craig and the other three rotated in ways that seemed to have a logic to them, though no one outside their group understood what the schedule was or who was maintaining it. One of them was always there. Craig was there more than the others. He slept in the chair in the corner of the room in short, precise increments and was always awake when anything changed. On the fifth day, Nathan spoke. Not a full sentence, not a declaration. 2 words, and they cost him a visible effort, the effort of a man who had borrowed against everything to make a purchase and was now paying the interest. He said Craig's name. Not his actual name, his call sign. That was how they knew each other, in the deep and practical way. Institutional names were for paperwork. The names they had given each other were the ones that lived in the room. Craig made the noise of a man who was not going to cry, but was dealing with something in the vicinity of it. He said something back, also 2 words, also a call sign, and the rest of the room gave them a moment by pretending to look at other things. Alan Greer was reviewing the updated imaging results when the nurse on the current shift came to find him. The imaging showed what he had hoped it would show, which was not miraculous in its presentation but was promising in a way that the initial imaging had not been. There was damage. There were things that would require time and specific intervention, and a patience that none of Nathan's organs were particularly famous for. But the damage was survivable in ways that were now visible on the scan in front of him. He carried the scan results to Bay 4 himself, rather than sending them through the normal channels. He was not sure why, exactly, except that he felt the situation warranted his presence, rather than a note from a resident. He stood in the doorway. Craig was in the chair. Nathan was awake, more continuously than he had been, though the word awake still required qualification at this stage. His eyes were open and tracking, and, most significantly, there was something in them that had not been there 41 hours ago, or 24 hours ago, or even 12 hours ago. Recognition. Continuous, present, current recognition. Nathan looked at Alan with the expression of a man who had been told that someone was going to come with information and was waiting for the information. Alan told him what the imaging showed. He used clear language. He did not dress it up, and he did not soften it in ways that would have been dishonest. There was damage. There would be rehabilitation. The road would be long, and it would require specific work that Nathan would need to do actively, not just endure passively. Nathan listened to all of this with an expression that did not change. When Alan finished, Nathan looked at him for a moment, and then he looked at the ceiling, and then he looked back at Alan. His voice was rough and minimal, the voice of a man running on reserve power. He asked one question. He asked how long. Alan told him the honest answer, which was that it depended on too many variables to be precise, but that they were looking at months and not weeks. Nathan nodded. One nod. Filed. He asked his second question. He asked when he could start. Alan looked at him for a moment. He said that they would begin as soon as the team determined Nathan was stable enough for early physiotherapy. Nathan nodded again. One nod. Craig, from the corner, said quietly that they had found their guy again. No one responded to this. It did not require a response. The rehabilitation began 9 days after Nathan was admitted to Balboa. It began in the bed because the bed was where he was, and what could be done in the bed was begun there. The occupational therapist was a woman named Grace Cole, which shared his last name, and about which Nathan made exactly one dry comment that Grace considered the highest form of compliment from a man she could already tell was not generous with words. She was patient and specific, and did not mistake his silence for resistance. She understood, from her experience with patients whose bodies were rebuilding, that silence is sometimes the sound of enormous effort. She worked with him the way you work with someone who is capable of more than they are currently able to do, which is a different kind of work than managing someone who is not. Nathan worked. That was what everyone who was involved in his care during those weeks said later, in different ways, that he worked. Not with inspiration or drama, without complaint, without self-pity, without the detours that many patients took through anger at their situation, or despair about the distance between where they were and where they needed to be. He treated it as a job. He showed up for the work. He did the work. He measured his progress in the same way he measured everything, which was precisely and without embellishment. The ventilator was removed on the 8th day. The moment his lungs took over their own work completely, Nathan's face did something that the nurse on duty described later as looking like a man who had just finished a very long argument and won. His strength returned in increments, not linearly. There were days where the progress reversed slightly, where the body renegotiated the terms, where Nathan would be further along in the morning and pulled back by the evening. He did not express frustration at these days. He simply noted them, made whatever adjustment was within his control, and came back the next morning. The 4 men on the wall became 2, became 1. Craig was the last. He did not stay because he was ordered to, or because he had nowhere to be. He had places to be. He chose to be here instead. He brought Nathan things. Books at first, which Nathan read in the careful way of someone relearning sustained concentration. Then a notebook without comment which Nathan accepted without comment and which he used in a way that Craig did not ask about because Nathan's internal life had always been his own. Paula stopped by Bay 4 on shifts when she was not assigned to it. Briefly, without making an event of it, she would check in, ask Nathan a plain question. He would give her a plain answer. Once, near the end of the 3rd week, she walked past, and he said her name as she went by, and she stopped. He told her, in the flat economy of someone for whom each word was selected carefully, that he had heard her. She said she had thought he might. He said it had been the right word. She said she was glad. That was the whole conversation. She walked on. He watched her go with the expression of a man who had just completed a transaction of some importance and could now move on to the next thing. On the 30th day, Nathan Cole stood up. Not without help. Not without the careful presence of the physical therapist and the handrail beside the bed. His legs were not the legs that had carried him through training and deployments and all the years before this room, and they communicated this to him plainly. He registered the information and did not argue with it. But he stood. The room was not full. It was Craig and Grace and the nurse on duty and Nathan. That was all. No ceremony, no documentation of the moment beyond what the medical team recorded in the chart. Nathan stood and looked across the room. He looked at the window on the far side. He stood there for a moment, finding his balance, finding the ground under his feet, finding what was still there. Craig said nothing. He watched with his arms loosely at his sides, the way he stood against walls, and his expression was the expression of a man who had done the math on this moment several hundred times over the past 30 days, and was now watching the answer resolve correctly. Nathan looked at the window. He took 1 step. His body did not make it easy. His body made a strong, honest argument for sitting back down. He heard the argument and kept going. He took 1 step, and then another, and then he stopped, because 2 steps was enough for the first time, and he knew that. And stopping at 2 was not failure and was not frustration. He turned around. He looked at the bed he had just come from. The bed with the ventilator hose still attached to the stand. The monitors with their green numbers. The chair in the corner where Craig had not slept well for a month. He looked at Craig. Craig was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he always said when Nathan did something that was both extremely difficult and completely typical of him, which was almost nothing, delivered in a dry tone that carried approximately a year's worth of feeling in it. He said, "There he is." Nathan looked at him for a moment. He said, "Still here." Those were the words, not a speech, not a declaration, not the articulation of anything that would read dramatically in a record somewhere. 2 words that meant what they meant to the people in the room, and everything else to the 2 people who had just said them to each other. The nurse on duty made a note in the chart. Grace set a small mark against the day's objective. The window let in the light that was present in San Diego in the late afternoon, yellow and flat and ordinary. Nathan took his 2 steps back to the bed and sat down with the controlled care of a man rationing his effort correctly. And then he picked up the notebook from the bedside table, and he opened it to where he had left off. The worn piece of kit, the small thing Paula had found on him when he arrived and set on the bedside table, sat where it had sat for 30 days. A patch, small, faded at the edges, the kind of thing that means something only to the person it belongs to, and means it completely. Nathan reached out and picked it up. He held it in his palm the way you hold something you are confirming still exists. He set it back down. He opened the notebook. He went back to work.